Hello, friends. This is an essay that we are discussing today. Is there an Indian way of thinking? An informal essay by A.K. Ramanujan. This essay appeared in the anthology or the book India Through Hindu Categories. It was also published in the periodical Contributions to Indian Sociology. A.K. Ramanujan was a very important scholar of post colonial India. He was from South India, very well versed in Tamil and Kannada literatures, poet, academic, philologist. He was also a folklorist and translator. He has done tremendous work on collecting and anthologizing, studying, curating ancient literature of South India. The translations and studies that he has made includes Interior Landscape, which is a collection of translations of love poems from Kuruntokai, an ancient Tamil text. And also Speaking of Shiva, a collection of Vajana poems of the Bhakti poets of the 10th century AD. So here in Interior Landscape especially, Ramanujan talks of Tinai poetics, Tinai, Tinai, Tinai poetics. What is Tinai poetics? We'll be talking about in the course of this essay briefly. So I have put here all the points that I said just now. Take a look at it again. A.K. Ramanujan lived from 1929 to 1993. He was a scholar, poet, academic, playwright, philologist, who is an earlier kind of linguist, folklorist, and translator. He translated and brought out studies of ancient Tamil and Kannada literature, and the post-colonial perspective predominated in his writing. Some of the major works of Ramanujan includes Interior Landscape, translations of love poems from Kuruntokai, showing Tinai poetics, and Speaking of Shiva, translation of, spelling mistake, translation of Vajanas of the Bhakti poets of the 10th century AD. Now, an introduction to this essay. Is there an Indian way of thinking? Before I give you the introduction, tell me, is there an Indian way of thinking? Is there an Indian way of thinking? What do you think? Is there an Indian way of thinking? Well, is there an Indian way of thinking? An informal essay appeared in the book India Through Hindu Categories, also in Contributions to Indian Sociology. The central concern in this essay is whether there is an Indian way of thinking and how it is different from the Western way of thinking. Ramanujan says that Indian thinking is characterized by contradiction, hypocrisy, inconsistency, and context sensitivity. When he says hypocrisy, inconsistency, etc., you would think he is attacking Indian thought, but actually he is full of praise for it. However, Ramanujan holds that behind the apparent diversity of Indian thinking, there is a unity. The essay argues that there are very great advantages in Indian thinking as well as Western thinking, and he actually suggests a medium path. And he's also not judging which is better or which is inferior. He's actually giving us a description of both methods of thinking. As you know, the essay is subtitled An Informal Essay, and the essay has an epigraph. Now, let's talk about the epigraph. Walter Benjamin once dreamed of hiding behind a phalanx of quotations, which, like highwaymen, would ambush the passing reader and rob him of his convictions. What is this epigraph? Walter Benjamin. He was a very major philosopher of the modernist canon, also Marxist. Walter Benjamin once dreamed of hiding behind a phalanx. Phalanx is like an army or troop of policemen. A phalanx of quotations which, like highwaymen, would ambush the passing reader. So many quotations that ambush the passing reader, attack the passing reader, and rob him of his convictions. The reader will get confused. Walter Benjamin, like Ramanujan, realizes that there is nothing original. Everything is a quotation or a misquote from somewhere else. Write a whole essay full of quotations. Hide behind the quotations. Let the reader be ambushed. You will think, what is this, Walter Benjamin? You don't know that this is Ramanujan's style. Ramanujan is like that. Throughout this essay, he is giving bang, 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 like machine gun shots. He is referring to philosophies and linguistic theories and history and this and that and mythology, Sanskrit poetics. Oh my God. You are really ambushed. I took many days to study this essay and master everything. It's not easy. So, by putting forward different points of view through the quotations, why is the author giving many quotations in the book, in the essay? He's putting forward different points of view without nailing his colors means flag, to any single mast. The compiler of the phalanx disturbs the reader's certainties. The reader doesn't know what to think because one quotation says this, another quotation is contradictory, a third quotation brings in a new idea. Complete confusion, there is no certainty. So the style that Ramanujan uses, which is a phalanx of quotations, is to show that there is no certainty in thinking. That is the Indian style of thinking. You can't say one thing and get away with it. There are so many interacting, intersecting, conflicting ideas. This refers to a procedure that Ramanujan himself follows in his essays. He does use a phalanx of quotations and examples, a technique which Ramanujan defines as an anthology. Anthology, is a collection of essays or collection of poems. Here, a collection of quotations that he gives in an essay, he calls it an anthology. And this term anthology is indicated in his titles and subtitles. Look at his titles, Toward an Anthology of Reflections, Towards an Anthology of City Images, etc. So many of his essays, he was a great scholar, erudite scholar. So many of his essays were titled with the word anthology in it. So this technique allows a simple structure of thoughts. This technique allows a simple structure of thought centered on the stated theme to have multiple resonances. There will be a stated theme, a simple structure of thought centered on the stated theme, which will have multiple resonances. Now, I'm going to read parts of the essay. So much is there in this essay, I'll read and explain. There are 6 parts. And I will start with the first part, of course. Stanislavski had an excuse for his exercise. Stanislavski had an exercise for his actors. He would give them an everyday sentence like, "Bring me a cup of tea," and ask them to say it 40 different ways, using it to beg, question, mock, wheedle, be imperious, etc. My question, says Ramanujan, is there an Indian way of thinking is a good one for such an exercise. Depending on where the stress is placed, it contains many questions. One question contains many questions, all of which are real questions that are asked again and again when people talk about India. When people talk about India, they do ask this question again and again in different ways with different connotations. Here are a few possible versions. Is there an Indian way of thinking? 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 The answers are just as various. Here are a few. There was an Indian way of thinking. There isn't anymore. Once upon a time, you can say there was an Indian way of thinking. If you want to learn about the Indian way of thinking, do not ask the modern day cityfied Indians. Go to the Pandits instead, the Vaidyas, the old texts. On the contrary, India never changes. So at first he's saying there used to be an Indian way of thinking. It is not there anymore because India has become cityfied. India is now a metropolis. All the traditional ways have died out. On the contrary, he is also saying India never changes. The Indian way never gets out of date, out of fashion. Under the veneer of the modern, Indians still think like the Vedas. So he's from the beginning presenting two perspectives. What is he doing here? He's glorifying tradition. He's glorifying the past and the past ways of thinking and doing things. And he's also suggesting that tradition is permanent. The second question might elicit answers like these. The second question, what is that? Is there an Indian way of thinking? Is there one single Indian way of thinking? The answer is there is no single Indian way of thinking. There are great and little traditions. India is not just one tradition. There are big, great traditions in India. There are little traditions in India, ancient and modern, rural and urban, classical and folk. Each language, caste, and region has its special worldview. That means what? In India, there is diversity. There are so many perspectives, diversity, and equal importance is given to all castes, all languages, all traditions, all regions, and every perspective is unique. There is no overarching Indian tradition. India is a multiplicity of traditions. Clear? The third question might be answered. What we see in India is nothing special to India. What is the third question? Do you remember? Is there an Indian way of thinking? You can say there is nothing special that is called Indian. It is nothing but pre-industrial, pre-printing press. India is not modern yet. It is pre-industrial, pre-printing press, face-to-face, agricultural, feudal. India is not modern. And all the different people in India, the Marxists, the Freudians, the McLuhanites, all of them have a different label for India and its present stage. So there is nothing called uniquely Indian, because everything that enters India becomes Indian. It turns all things, including its enemies and rivals, into itself, says Ramanujan. How it turns all things, especially rivals and enemies, into itself. Everything that enters India becomes Indian. This is similar to America, where everything becomes American, but there are big differences. In America, it is colonial and oppressive. In India, it is more like a broad-minded approach to all cultures, an all-inclusive approach. There is an Indian way, says Ramanujan, but it imprints and patterns all things that enter the continent. Everything, the Mughals entered the continent, Before that, the Aryans entered. After that, the British entered. The British who remained in India became Anglo-Indians. Everything that entered India changed in its original form and became Indian. So, everything that enters India gets imprinted and patterned. It is inescapable. It is bigger than all of us. India is not a single stream. It is an ocean where all streams that enter it blend. India changes whatever enters into it. Into Indian culture, whatever enters will get completely changed, says Ramanujan. And the whole of India is more important than the parts. What is important is India, which is bigger than all of us, than all the parts. To protect one, in today's context, all this discussion is very relevant. To protect the, needs and ethos of the majority, we can't just wipe out the minorities. To protect some people in India, we can't just ignore the other people. Everybody is important. India is synonymous with magnanimity towards culture. It is cultural inclusion. Now, what was the fourth question? Is there an Indian way of thinking? The fourth question may question whether Indians think at all. See, this is almost an Orientalist perception that Ramanujan is saying here. A sarcasm is there. He says, we will question whether Indians think at all. It is the West that is materialistic and rational. Indians have no philosophy, only religion. No positive sciences, not even a psychology. In India, there are no sciences, some people think. There is no thinking. In India, matter is subordinated to spirit. Rational thought is subordinated to feeling and intuition. If you see many early Hollywood films, etc., Indians were presented, in Gandhi film, for example, Indians were presented as the masses without identity. They are emotional, not rational. You can see this in Macaulay's Minutes. The British perspective on India, the Orientalist perspective on India, largely thought of Indians as emotional, as irrational, as spiritual. This is Orientalism. They turned India into the demonic other and the exotic other. So some lament the fact that Indians don't think. Others celebrate India's unthinking ways. There is no end to this discussion. So what happened till now? This is the first part of the essay. Ramanujan started off by exploring 4 possible interpretations of this central question using the Stanislavskian exercise for actors. What does it involve? It involves asking the question differently each time, emphasizing a different keyword and getting different meanings. Each time, Ramanujan says, we get a number of answers showing the apparent contradictions and inconsistencies in the Indian way of thinking. Ramanujan, through this exercise, is showing the apparent contradictions and inconsistencies in the Indian way of thinking. The diversity of approaches that characterizes Indian thinking reflects the diversity that is inherent in India. India is as diverse as its many approaches. India, the nation, its people is diverse, like its diversity of thinking. But beneath this diversity that characterizes the people and their, what did I mean? Thinking. Yeah. I was saying, but beneath this diversity that characterizes the people and their thinking, there is, ta-dang, what is there? A unity. Okay, now we move on to the second part of the essay. This is an easy part where he talks about his own father. He says, The problem was posed for me personally. The problem of diverse thinking and unity, etc., was posed for me personally at the age of 20 in the image of my father. I had never taken a good look at him till then. And he is laughing at himself and his relationship with his father. Remember his poem, Obituary. Obituary is a poem, very sarcastic, cynical, but loving poem that Ramanujan wrote about his father. It's very famous. He says he never really looked at his father till then and says, "Didn't Mark Twain say, at 17 I thought my father was ignorant? At 20 I wondered how he learned so much in 3 years." It is not the father who changed, it is the son. Indeed, this essay was inspired by contemplation of him over the years and is dedicated to him. Ramanujan says the essay is dedicated to his father, whose life was full of contradictions. That is why it is dedicated to his father. His father is a representation of tradition. He's analogous to tradition that is diverse, because his father is also very diverse. We will see how. And when he says, when he quotes Mark Twain, he's asking, do we ever understand our father properly? Do we ever understand our tradition and culture properly? Can we understand our tradition and culture properly? That is what he's asking. Ramanujan asserts that such contradiction is the very nature of an Indian way of thinking. This contradiction that represented his father was the very nature of his father's identity, and it was both exclusive and inclusive. The father is like India. All diversity is blended into one. Let's see how. Ramanujan's father was a South Indian Brahmin whose very clothes showed the inconsistencies in his inner self. A South Indian Brahmin who wore neat white turbans, that is his clothes. He wore white turbans, a Vaishnava caste mark on his forehead, and also sometimes a diamond earring. At the same time, he wore Western ties, buttons, collar studs, English jackets, a very traditional Brahmin come Western clothes. He wore socks and leather patented shoes. And when he wore shoes, he carefully took them off before entering the house. That means he showed his Brahmin nature. See? So all these things characterized him, a blend of tradition and modernity. Now, what is his father? He was a mathematician and an astrologer, both. Mathematics is a science, Western science. Astrology is an Indian, probably superstitious belief. A Sanskrit scholar he was, and an astronomer, both. He would read the Gita religiously and later talk about rationalists like Bertrand Russell and Ingersoll appreciatively. Both Gita and Russell, influenced him. Very funny, isn't it, this inconsistency? Such inconsistencies in his behavior and attitudes never bothered his father, says Ramanujan. Ramanujan's father was never bothered by these contradictions. This he considers representative of the way of thinking of all Indians. And this is what prompts Western intellectuals to ask the question, is there an Indian way of thinking? Now, he is himself talking about what he thought of his father. I and my generation was troubled by his holding together in one brain both astronomy and astrology. One is science, the other is regarded as pseudoscience. I looked for consistency in him, a consistency he didn't seem to care about or even think about. When I asked him what the discovery of Pluto and Neptune did to his archaic 9-planet astrology, he said, "You make the necessary corrections, that's all." Or that was the time when Pluto and Neptune were discovered. or in answer to how he could read the Gita religiously, having bathed and painted his forehead the red and white feet of Vishnu, and later talked appreciatively about Bertrand Russell and even Ingersoll. They were against Indian superstitious beliefs and they were rationalists. And then the father replied, the Gita is part of one's hygiene. Besides, don't you know, the brain has two lobes. Wonderful. This is like once I have taught a lot of Christian nuns in the classroom, a lot of Christian nuns, Catholic nuns. And when I teach them about Reformation and all that, Milton's Paradise Lost or Lycidas, etc., we have to necessarily talk about the corruption in the Catholic Church. We have to talk against the Catholic Church, how Catholicism has been rejected and replaced by other approaches like Protestantism. One day I asked the sisters, is it difficult for you to sit in class and listen to all this rational, deconstruction of Catholicism and then go back and pray in your church? Is it affecting your faith? The sisters said, absolutely not. The sisters reacted like Ramanujan's father. That is different. They don't mix up the two. And then Ramanujan quotes his own collage-like poem called Astronomer, bringing together science, religion, mythology, and everyday life. Also astrology, superstition, everything. Look at the poem. Sky man in a manhole. Sky man is the astrologer, astronomer. With astronomy for dream, astrology for nightmare. Fat man full of proverbs, the language of lean years. Proverbs is the language of lean years. When you don't have more words, enough words, you use proverbs. Living in square after almanac square. Living in square after almanac square. Look at the irony. Prefiguring the day of windfall and landslide through a calculus of good hours, clutching at the tear in his birthday shirt. They were very poor, that is the meaning. As at the hole in his mildewed horoscope. He's making fun of the plight of his father in a very ironic sense, tone, which you can see in obituary also. Now, moving on, the third part now. Please understand that the third and fourth parts do not move so easily. It is so full of quotations, as I already warned you. In this part, he talks about what is India, what it means by India. There are so many different versions of India, definitions of India. He talks about how Englishmen and modern Indians have all talked about the inconsistency of Indians' approaches. He brings together the East and the West, the upper class and lower class, the tradition and modernity, truth and fiction. And he says, about 20 years ago, the Illustrated Weekly of India asked a number of modern Indian intellectuals to describe the Indian character. They did not seem to be daunted by the assignment, and all of them happily wrote terse, some quite sharp columns. They all seemed to agree on one thing, the Indian trait of hypocrisy. The Indians do not tell the truth easily. That is what some people think. Other people, Max Muller has famously said, Indians tell the truth. Indians do not mean what they say and say different things at different times. By Indians, they did not mean only servants. Look at the sarcasm and irony. Before, Indians mean servants in the time of British Raj. And when the people who wrote for Illustrated Weekly of India wrote about Indians, they meant not only servants. In Max Muller's lectures on India, however, the second chapter was called Truthful Character of the Hindus in answer to many complaints. So, many people think that Indians don't tell the truth, many people think they tell the truth. Look at the inconsistency of definitions of what is India. And then he says, recently I attended a conference on karma. He is talking about karma. Karma is a very common, popular word in the West also these days. But in the days that Ramanujan wrote this essay, probably not. A notion that is almost synonymous in some circles with whatever is Indian or Hindu. Across the world, people know karma means Indian or Hindu. Across the world, in some circles. The funny thing is, in India, many people don't even know what is karma. They don't think of it at all. Before I move on, let me give you an example from my own life. When I went to Canada to do my PhD, the professor, the head of the department where I was studying, he said, "Oh, you're a visiting scholar from India." And he began to talk to me about yoga in detail, Bharatanatyam in detail. I at that time knew neither yoga nor Bharatanatyam. He knew more about all these things than I did. You know, what we define as India is the land of yoga, India is the land of Bharatanatyam. That does not mean everybody in India does it, that they know it. Did you understand? Like that. Karma is synonymous with India, but many people in India do not even know it. However, karma is so important that Brahminical texts had it, the Buddhists had it, the Jainas had it. But when I looked at hundreds of Kannada tales, I couldn't find a single tale that used karma as a motive or motif. Karma was not even talked about in South Indian texts. Yet, when their children made a mess, their repertoire of abuse included, "Oh, you are my karma." In South India, ordinary villagers used the word karma as a word of abuse. Just imagine. So he is showing the inconsistencies. Why is he talking about karma? He is showing the inconsistencies in the classical, folk, and everyday use of the term. When different people use it in different contexts, it has different meanings. Even in India, karma is not one thing. Did you understand? That is why he's talking about it. And then he talked about how Harper, he is quoting Harper, Edward B. Harper, who has written an essay, A Hindu Village Pantheon. He is quoting Harper from 1959 and saying that many Indian villagers didn't know much about karma or incarnation. What we are defined by, those villagers did not even know. Then, next he talks about Cheryl Daniel. Cheryl Daniel is a South Asian studies scholar. Asian studies is a very important branch of knowledge today. Asian studies has another branch called Indology. Both Indology and Asian studies were there in colonial times, and now they are there in post-colonial times also. And Cheryl Daniel is a South Asian studies scholar. She independently found that her Tamil village alternately used karma and talaividhi, or head writing, as we can translate it, as explanations for the events around them. When children, are naughty, mothers will say, "Oh, it is my talaividhi to have children like this." Fate, destiny, this would be equivalence. So, here Ramanujan is showing how some villagers, according to Cheryl Daniel, used the terms karma and talaividhi. The two notions are inconsistent with each other. They are not the same. They are similar, but they are inconsistent. Karma implies the self's past determine the present. Karma means what you have done in the past will decide and determine your present. It is an iron chain of cause and consequence. Karma is an iron chain of cause and consequence, an ethic of responsibility. Karma is a chain. Your actions will affect your future. Talaividhi is one's fate inscribed arbitrarily at one's birth. It has nothing to do with your action. It is there in your head, in your forehead, or somewhere there. Already when you are born, it is already there. The inscription has no relation to one's prior actions. Usually in such explanations and folktales about them, past lives are not even part of the scheme. So what Ramanujan is showing here is even basic concepts that define us, they don't have one meaning. Their meanings are so diverse, interpretations are so diverse. You can't fix meaning anywhere. Meaning is very fluid. Now, Ramanujan wrote this in 1989, and this is a time when post-structuralism had already, ruled the West, started creating a storm, a revolution in the West. The ideas of post-structuralism are deeply ingrained into this essay. Ramanujan has been influenced by post-structuralism quite a lot, we can see. Because meanings are multiple, plural. There are no single meanings. Everything is dependent on the context. Structuralism, post-structuralism, etc. have seriously talked about these ideas in a big way. And remember, Ramanujan worked as a lecturer, as a professor in the universities of the US. In Harvard University, University of Wisconsin, University of Michigan. Across US, he taught in the 1960s, where Derrida, Lacan, etc. were already creating a big revolution. So he was definitely influenced by post-structuralism and its ideas of decentering of meaning, plurality of meaning, meaning being related to context, meanings are shifting, etc. Right? So he is explaining this with the two words karma and talaividhi. Another related characteristic seems to preoccupy observers. We have already said that inconsistency, like my father's, or the Brahmin or Jaina use of the word karma, is not a matter of inadequate education or lack of logical rigor. Westerners would think that Indians are like this. They are very plural in their attitudes. They don't fix meanings very much. People are a mix of different approaches, like Ramanujan's father. Westerners might think that this is a sign of inadequate education. But Ramanujan is saying, it is not about inadequate education. The rest of the essay is about how the perspectives of India, the ways of thinking in India are great, probably greater than the West also. The Indians may be using a different logic altogether. It is just that they are different. Some thinkers believe that such logic is an earlier stage of cultural evolution. Some critics believed that the logic of Indians is primitive, referring to an earlier stage of cultural evolution, and that Indians have not developed a notion of data or objective facts. Indians are always subjective. They don't have an idea of objective facts or truth. Some people will attack Indians. But Ramanujan thinks that it is not about inadequate education. It is because education in India is broad-minded, embraces diversity. I mean the traditional education, not contemporary education of universities and colleges, but traditionally education was understood in India as an embracing of differences, diversity. Western objective scientific perceptions, on the other hand, are very narrow and linear. compared to Indians' perspectives. That is what Ramanujan is trying to prove. And then moving on, the next he says is about how Edward Said and Henry Kissinger have thrown light on this issue. Edward Said, as you know, wrote Orientalism just one decade before Ramanujan's essay came. He cites many such European stereotypes about the third world. How Westerners are narrow minded and they don't understand India in the right perspective. They create stereotypes. And here is Henry Kissinger's explanation. Henry Kissinger is not a very great theorist we will look up to. He was the US Secretary of State during the Vietnam War, when US unnecessarily interfered in the Vietnam War and dropped more bombs in the Vietnam than in the Second World War, probably it is said. Destroyed Vietnam, incurred the wrath of people of America as well as across the world. That infamous man, Henry Kissinger, showed his Orientalist, narrow-minded perspective on Indians like this. Not only Indians, the Easterners. Cultures which escaped the early impact of Newtonian thinking. Henry Kissinger is thinking that Newtonian thinking or Newtonian science is the ultimate. Cultures which escaped the early impact of Newtonian thinking have retained the essentially pre-Newtonian view that the world is almost completely internal to the observer. Countries like India that have a pre-Newtonian view think that the world is internal. They look inwards while the Westerners look outwards. Looking outwards is considered to be a wonderful thing, in the West. Consequently, empirical reality, empirical means learned through experience, has a much different significance for many of the new countries. Ramanujan saying, are you calling India a new country? Or would you rather say old country? Look at the traditions in India. When did Kalidasa or greatest thinkers and scientists of India live? And when did your scientists live? So India has thousands of years more tradition than these Western countries, he is insinuating. And he says, Henry Kissinger says, consequently, empirical reality has a much different significance for many of the new countries than for the West. Because Kissinger says, in a certain sense, these new countries like India never went through the process of discovering it. We are called new countries because we got independence in 1947. That doesn't make us a new culture though. And he is saying, we did not study or discover Newtonian physics, that is why we are behind. Don't worry, Ramanujan will reply. So this is showing the very, narrow perspective, Orientalist perspective of the Westerners. And Henry Kissinger is a very notorious example of this kind of narrow-minded approach. Indology, let me just talk to you about indology. Studying about India, as I told you, was a very important activity in the colonial period, at which time it was not completely free from prejudices and stereotypes. Indology is also associated with post-colonial times. And a lot of Germans were associated with indology, starting from Max Müller. Lots of German scholarship you can see in indological studies. What is indology? Indology is the reconceptualizing of intellectual history of South Asia. The intellectual history of South Asia is reconceptualized. And this is a very important engagement within post-colonial studies, and it is integrally connected to issues of our identity and culture. Today, our identity, culture, etc. in India is related to issues of Asian studies and Indology. So this is all part of Indology, these diverse approaches. Now, such a view of Kissinger cannot be dismissed as peculiar to Kissinger's version of Newtonian optics. You can't just blame Kissinger, says our Ramanujan. One meets with it again and again in travelogues, psychological writings, novels. A lot of thinkers and travelers have come to India and claimed to know about India. They wrote about India with a pseudo authority. You understand? And Naipaul, V.S. Naipaul has written such a travelogue. An area of darkness, India a wounded civilization, and India a million mutinies now. All these travelogues, three travelogues, it's a trilogy, presented India in a very negative light. India and Hinduism were presented in a very negative light. And to support his argument, Naipaul quotes the New Delhi psychologist Sudhir Kakar. Sudhir Kakar is a sophisticated New Delhi psychoanalyst, deeply knowledgeable in matters Indian as well as Western. He is both an insider and an outsider. So he is saying, he is quoting Sudhir Kakar. In India, it is closer to a certain stage in childhood. Sudhir Kakar is talking about Indians as infantile. In India, it is what is closer among Indians, there seems to be a different relationship to outside reality. That is what he says at first. Our relationship to the outside reality is different from the Westerners' relationship with outside reality. Science separates the inside and the outside. And, it considers the inside and the outside as two different and separate things. In India, that distinction is not there. What is inside and outside, that distinction is not there. Very importantly, in post-structuralism, in Derridian thinking also, there is a breaking free from the boundaries of the text. There is no inside and outside to the text, isn't it? This is a post-structuralist idea. So, in India, this outside is closer to a certain stage in childhood when outer objects did not have a separate independent existence but were intimately related to the self and its affective states. When we were children, we did not actually realize that our toys are different from us. Toys are external things, I don't need them. What is important is what is internal. That is what an adult would understand, but a child may not understand. So, Indians are in a state of infantile misconception about inside and outside, it seems. That is why, because they can't distinguish between inside and outside, that is why they are like children. That is why they are, being very subjective and bringing the inside into the outside. That is what Sudhir Kakar is saying. So, in other words, what he is saying is that the Indian ego is underdeveloped. He is saying that the Indian ego is underdeveloped, and there is a world of magic and animism in India. Animism means the belief that objects, places, etc. have, spiritual significance. There is a spiritual essence to places, to trees, to things, etc. That is animism. All these are there in India. So, animism is an example of how Indians do not distinguish between inside and outside. For the Westerner, spirituality is what is inside. A tree or a place cannot have spirituality. Did you understand? In a memorable, and then our Ramanujan moves on. Ramanujan quotes from E.M. Foster's A Passage to India, where Mrs. Moore sees a wasp and very tenderly lets the wasp out of the window. It's a very famous scene. Mrs. Moore muses vividly on the relations between inside and outside in India. The confounding of the two is not special to humans in India. It is not only for humans, even for animals and insects, inside and outside difference is not there. Going to hand up her cloak, this is from the book Passage to India. Going to hand up her cloak, she found the tip of the peg was occupied by a small wasp. Perhaps he mistook the peg for a branch. No Indian animal has any sense of an interior. Bats, rats, birds, insects, all will as soon nest inside the house as out. Inside our houses, there are lots of ants and insects and mosquitoes. Nobody cares. But in the West, if you find ants or a mosquito or even a rat, oh my god, there will be such a big ruckus. When I was in Canada, once there was a rat in the basement, and we had to call some pesticide people, the Department of Pest Control. They brought us and sealed the base. They brought machines to our house, sealed the basement, hunted down the rat. It was such a funny thing. In India, many of us live in a brotherly, relationship with all these animals and insects inside our house, isn't it? And Ramanujan is saying it is because in India, neither human beings nor animals have the distinction between inside the house and outside the house. It is to them a normal growth of the eternal jungle, which alternately produces houses, trees, houses, trees. Look at Ramanujan's humor. In the Indian context, the civilization or houses are part of the eternal jungle. The insects will think this eternal jungle is there inside the house also. They will live everywhere. So he is making fun in a very genial manner. He's saying these things about Indian culture with a genial humor. And then he says there are simpaticos. Simpaticos means people who sympathize and understand and care. Before I talk about simpaticos, I have to say something else about what just passed. So I was saying that the Westerners' relationship to outside reality is very different from those of us in India. We Indians use the outside reality to preserve a continuity of the self. We consider that the nature or place or outside reality is a continuation of ourself. Even when all the things outside are changing all the time, the place is changing, weather is changing, people around us are changing, we consider the outside reality as part of our identity. Did you understand? That is why. So I didn't mention that point. Now coming back to the simpaticos, the people who care, understand, sympathize. Heinrich Robert Zimmer, that is a very important German Indologist and linguist. He was a linguist, the very famous linguist after Max Muller. And he was also a South Asian historian. Now, simpaticos praise the Indians for not being hung up on an objectivity that distinguishes self from non-self, interior from exterior. Zimmer says that Indians do not depend on the binary opposition between self and non-self, interior and exterior. That kind of pseudo-objectivity they don't have. Ramanujan is actually referring to interior landscape or Thinai poetics here. India, especially South India, has no distinction between interior and exterior. That idea is connected to Thinai poetics. In Thinai poetics, there are two aspects, Agam and Puram. Agam and Puram. We will come to that later when we talk about some excerpts from poetry that he will give us presently. I think we will, or let me just finish this slide first. So keep it in mind, this is Thinai poetics, the non-distinction between inside and outside. What for Naipaul is a defect of vision. Naipaul has written India, a Wounded Civilization. I told you, it's the second part of the travelogue trilogy. There, Naipaul has written an essay called India, a Defect of Vision. India, a Defect of Vision. And that is what Ramanujan says. What is a defect of vision for Naipaul is for Zimmer, vision itself. Ramanujan in that essay, Nepal, in that essay, argued that Indians are very different from Westerners in their worldview. Nepal says that Indians are very different from Westerners in their worldview. In what way are they different? Nepal says Indians are self absorbed, they are less observant or objective, they are more instinctive and emotional. They are more emotional, less objective, self absorbed, less observant, and all this makes them ill adapted to the modern world. They are not very good citizens of the modern world. Now, Naipaul connects the failure of Indian civilization in this manner to the to it being shaped by Hinduism. Why Indian culture is so emotive and so subjective and self-absorbed is because it is shaped by Hinduism and its rituals. That is what Naipaul says, and he calls this aspect of Indian culture, its rootedness in Hinduism and self-absorption, etc., a defect of vision. Being more concerned with the inner self, internal aspects, is defect of vision. But for Zimmer, it is vision itself. India thinks of time and herself in biological terms of the species. In our Panjang, all of us are related to one star or astronomical star. We are related to one plant, one animal, don't you know, one place. This is like totemism in Native American cultures. Totemism is also the relationship of the human being with aspects of nature. So we in the East regard ourselves in biological terms, in terms of the species, not of the ephemeral ego. We are part of a larger whole concerning nature and humanity. We of the West regard world history as a biography of mankind, whereas the Westerner is different. The Westerner separates between nature and culture, and they regard world history as a biography of the Occidental men. The biography of the whites is what is called world history. Our will in the Westerners' case, their will is not to culminate in our human institutions, the universal play of culture. They don't mix up culture with nature. They don't indulge in universal play of nature. But what do they do? To evaluate, to set ourselves against the play with an egocentric tenacity. With a, tenacity means what? Of holding on without leaving something. With an egocentric tenacity, we are evaluating nature and the influence of nature in our lives. So that is what Zimmer says. Now let me just give you an overview of what has been happening. Another Indian trait of character that dismays both Englishmen and modern Indians, according to Ramanujan, is hypocrisy. That is what he talked about at the beginning of the third part. All seem to agree, especially those who wrote for the Illustrated Weekly of India, they seemed to agree that Indians do not have one truth but many truths. Indians do not mean what they say, and they say different things at different times. It is not probably hypocrisy, it is their diversity of opinions. Even with regard to something as fundamental to Indian thought as the concept of karma, we would think that karma is the most fundamental thing to Indian thought. Ramanujan says there is no consistency in its definition or application. What observers have noted is that this inconsistency is not the result of lack of education. Why Indians are so inconsistent is not because they are not educated. It is not because of lack of logical rigor, but because their education or logic is different. So, Western commentators like Henry Kissinger conclude that Indians are at an earlier stage of cultural evolution. They are very prejudiced and they don't understand India because India is different. And they say Indians are in an earlier stage of cultural evolution and that Indians have no understanding of objective data. However, all people are not like Kissinger. Others, like Zimmer, praise Indians for this lack of objectivity. Other people like Zimmer praise Indians for the lack of objectivity. They believe that the lack of objectivity is actually a good quality of the Indians. Now, at this point, I think I will just digress and talk to you about Thinai poetics. It is very important that you understand what is Thinai poetics. In Sangam literature is literature of many centuries in Tamil, the oldest of which is Tolkapiyam, after that Kuruntokai. Both these are famous examples of Thinai poetics. Also Silappatikaram, Tirukural, these are later poems, also part of Sangam literature, but they are not specifically connected with Thinai. Tolkapiyam that I mentioned is the earliest known literature in South India. And these are the epitome of mature classical poetry in Tamil. These books that I mentioned, like Tolkapiyam and Kuruntokai, are the epitome of mature classical poetry in Tamil. In these poems, you will find a blend of tradition and contemporaneity, a blend of passion and politeness, a blend of the interior and the exterior. These poems are bringing together contradictions, especially the contradictions of Agam and Puram. Agam and Puram. Agam means interior, Puram means exterior. Agam or interior means heart, mind, self, family, earth, love, poetry, etc. I will do one thing. At the end, I will put, a table. I will put a table here and I will explain. That will help you understand. Okay? Let me show you the table first. So this is the table on Thinai poetics. Thinai poetics is about Agam and Puram. Agam is interior and Puram is exterior. While Agam talks about heart and body surfaces, about heart and mind, Puram is about body surfaces. While Agam is about the self, Puram is about others. Agam is about family, Puram is about non-kin people. Agam, if it is about the earth, Puram is about ocean. And Agam is about love poetry, while Puram is about poetry of war and kings. Now, this Agam and Puram give rise to poetry. Agam poetry is there, Puram poetry is there. And you should understand that Agam poetry is further divided into many types. Agam poetry, for example, can be of 5 types. Named after plants or flowers. Agam poetry is of 5 kinds named after plants or flowers in Tamil. Kurinyi, Mullai, Palai, Neithal, Marudam. Each of these Thinais, they are all Thinais. The Thinais of the 5 different types of Agam poetry. They include not only the land and the plants, but also the animals and people that live there. And also, it relates to the feelings and moods of the characters that correspond to these plants and animals and places. All the Thinai poems belong to some Thinai or other. Kuruntokai, for example, is a Marudam poem. It is one of the Agam types. Now, Thinai poetics that thus relates the human emotions and experiences with nature is considered the finest expression of the aesthetics, philosophy and intelligence of pre-Aryan civilization in the classical Tamil history. So these texts, Tolkappiyam, that was written by a Jain scholar, Tolkapiyar, in the 6th century BC, same time as Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides. And Kuruntokai poems, they were not written by one man, they were written by over 200 poets in the 2nd to 4th century AD, much later. So they are the finest examples of Thinai. Now, why I talked about Thinai now is because Ramanujan was pointing out that Westerners think that India has no distinction between the outside and the inside, the interior and the exterior. And the Westerners themselves are divided in their opinion regarding this. And this is not because of lack of education. Ramanujan says this is the ancient culture of India. It is not a defect of vision like Naipaul seems to think. Zimmer was actually supporting Indian perspectives. A third trait should be added to inconsistency. So we already talked about inconsistency, and we also talked about the the distinction, the lack of distinction between hypocrisy, also lack of distinction between inside and outside. And he says, to the apparent ability to distinguish self and non-self, another trait that should be added is inconsistency. Another trait should be added. What is that? One has only to read Manu after a bit of Kant to be struck by the former's, that is Manu's, extraordinary lack of universality. We always focus on the particular. That we are inconsistent. We don't distinguish between inside and outside. We focus on the particular, not the universal. Western philosophers always gave importance to the universal. Universal human nature. That is what Kant in the Enlightenment period gave importance to. But Manu always rooted his ideas in the particular. So Manu seems to have no clear notion of a universal human nature from which one can deduce ethical decrees. Like man shall not kill, man shall not tell an untruth. Such universal decrees cannot be deduced in Manu's philosophy. Man can kill, but only in certain conditions, in certain situations. That is how Manu would say it. There is no overarching universal truth that Manu tells about anybody. One is aware of no notion of a state or unitary law of all men. One is aware of no universal law in India, no universal trait. That is absent. Now, Manu, quoted by Muller, is quoted by Ramanujan. He has said the following: a Kshatriya, having defamed a Brahmana, shall be fined 100 panas. Pana is money, coins. A Vaishya, 150 or 200. A Shudras shall suffer corporal punishment. See, there is no universal rule. It actually shows the evil of caste system. But Ramanujan is looking at it in a different way. Of course, it shows the evil of caste system, but it also shows that the Indians did not give importance to the universal laws. Universal laws are not there. Laws are all subjective and contextual. That is what Ramanujan is showing. For the same crime of defaming a Brahmana, a Kshatriya has to pay a small amount, a Vaishya has to pay a larger amount, a Shudra has to be killed. See the difference? Even truth-telling is not an unconditional imperative, as Muller's correspondents discovered. Muller's correspondents, people who corresponded with him, learned from Muller that even telling the truth is not a universal thing. Everybody should tell the truth. Not like that in India. In certain cases, in certain situations, we should not tell certain untruths. We should tell only truth. Like that, Indians describe these issues. Untruth spoken by people under the influence of anger, under the influence of excessive joy, under the influence of pain, fear, grief. Untruth spoken by infants, untruth spoken by very old men and women, by persons laboring under a delusion, untruth spoken for being under the influence of drink or by madmen, untruth that does not cause the speaker to fall, or as these are all venial sins, not mortal sins. Venial means not depriving the soul, that is minor. So actually Indian justice, if it is employed, will be much more just than Western justice. Because look at Jean Valjean. Jean Valjean stole a loaf of bread when he was just a young man, hardly grown up. And he was very hungry and he stole a loaf of bread. Stealing is wrong. Everybody who steals should be put in prison. That kind of universal rule applied to Jean Valjean. Whereas, if we had thought of the particulars, people who are hungry can steal because that they are stealing because the society doesn't take care of them, isn't it? So society should take care of its hungry people, and if they are not taken care of, those hungry people can steal. They can't be punished for it. That kind of a law is more just, isn't it? So even truth and untruth are contextual in India. That is what Max Muller has proved. Another man, Alexander Wilde. Who is that? He was a 19th century philosopher. He was also a philologist. Very important in Indology because he studied India. He was a member, one of the early members of the Theosophical Society of India of Annie Besant. And he wrote a very popular book, India, What It Can Teach Us. Our Alexander Wilde, the author of India, What It Can Teach Us. And he has also written several other books on Neoplatonism, etc. He added something to Max Muller's, idea of how even untruth is contextual and provisional in India. What did Alexander Wilde say? At the time of marriage, during dalliance. Dalliance means flirting or not being in a serious relationship. When life is in danger, when the loss of property is threatened, for the sake of a Brahmana, Manu declared, whenever the death of a man or any of the four castes would be occasioned by true evidence, in such cases, falsehood was even better than truth. To get two people married, you can tell untruth. During dalliance, when you are flirting, you should tell untruth, otherwise you can't flirt. When your life is in danger, to save your life, falsehood is better. When loss of property is threatened, you can resort to untruth. To save a Brahmana, that we can't accept these days to save anybody. We can tell untruth. Like this, Alexander Wilde notes that untruth in India is provisional. See, everything is contextual in India. Contrast this, Ramanujan is saying, contrast this with Kant's well-known formulation of his imperative. Kant made a famous imperative or a decree or statement. Act as if the maxim of your action were to become, through your will, a universal law of nature. Kant is saying that what is important in our action is to maintain the universal law of nature. Kant's formula of the universal law of nature is very important. It is a major part of his moral philosophy, and it is based on the concept of human reason, obviously. Kant was an Enlightenment philosopher, and he wrote about human reason as a very important aspect of humanity. Also, the belief in a constant and universal human nature. He talks about nature or universal human nature, universal law of human nature it is. The belief in a constant and universal human nature was fundamental to European Enlightenment. European Enlightenment was all about maintaining the values of human nature. So Kant is talking about universalization, whereas Manu or Max Muller or other Indian philosophers talked about the particular more than the universal. Did you understand? Universalization means putting oneself in another's place. It is the golden rule of the New Testament. Universalization is Christian. It is a golden rule of the New Testament. The Christian premise of universalization is related to homogenization. You know, we can critique the Christian premise of universalization. Christianity believes in universalization. That is why Christianity is spreading everywhere. They don't give importance to the particular cultural situation or the particular, region or belief. The belief is that, Christianity's belief is that there is only one truth and one good and one God for everyone. They don't consider the history or culture that is particular to a place or people. And this results in what Christian premise of universalization leads to homogenization. Everybody becomes one. Their differences are ignored. That doesn't create equality. Such a homogenization doesn't really create equality. Christian practices of education, Christian practices of medicine, Christian practices of many of the social institutions were all based on homogenization. You have headache and one painkiller for all kinds of headache. Whereas homeopathy or Ayurveda, for example, would look at the cause of the headache and give you different medicines for different headaches. Did you understand? Education also should not be homogeneous. You should take into consideration the people's culture, their limitations, their needs, their past history, and they might need different ways of getting knowledge, etc. But rooted in Christianity, Western institutions are highly homogenized, standardized, mechanized, and it all led to imperial domination and colonialism. So that was my explanation. Universalization means putting oneself in another's place. It is the golden rule of the New Testament. Hobbes's law of all men. Thomas Hobbes, who wrote Leviathan, talked about the state of nature. All human beings are in a state of nature where we are all naturally competitive and evil and violent. In the state of nature, we are competitive, evil and violent, and the aim of humanity in the state of nature should be self-preservation. Thomas Hobbes believed that the aim of humanity is to save themselves, to preserve themselves, for which they should choose an absolute sovereign who would rule over them. Did you understand? Hobbes condemns all acts that are destructive to human life. Human preservation is what is important. So humanity is treated as one in Hobbes also. So universalization is at the heart of the New Testament, at the heart of Hobbes's law of all men. What is that law? Do not do unto others what you do not want done unto you. Based in Christianity, Thomas Hobbes said, do not do unto others what you don't want done to you unto you. So that is also treating everybody as equal. The main tradition of Judeo-Christian ethics is based on such a premise of universalization. In a very conservative, upper caste, Brahminical manner, Ramanujan is suggesting that equality is a myth. You can't have equality or homogenization. It is not necessarily good. He's arguing against equality and universalization in a way. Manu, and he is actually supporting caste to a large extent. Manu will not understand such a premise, that everybody is equal, that people are all homogeneous and universalized. Manu will not understand. To be moral for Manu is to particularize. For Manu and Indians, what is important is the particular, not the general. To ask who did what, to whom, and when. Now, in almost every paragraph, sometimes in every sentence, our Ramanujan is quoting different philosophers and citing different concepts. So look at this anthology of his writing. Immediately after this, he talks about class. Each class or jati of man has his own laws, his own proper ethic, not to be universalized. He is supporting class or jati, varga, jati, etc. Divide human beings. That is what we think today. And Ramanujan is saying, in a very conservative Hindu manner, that jati creates different laws for different people. Every jati has its own laws. Every jati has its own ethic and should not be universalized. What is the law for Shudras cannot be the laws for Kshatriyas. That is how he is arguing. Hegel, who was a very prolific writer on India, did you know that? Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, the contemporary of Kant, the great Enlightenment philosopher, wrote a lot about India. India, a reinterpretation, is one of his important books. And Hegel's ideas have lots of similarities with Indian philosophy. And he wrote more about India than the Greek or classical civilization. Actually, he wrote about Indian art, religion, philosophy, and he was very critical of Indian caste system. Our Hegel. Look at what Hegel said. Hegel shrewdly noted this Indian slant. While we say bravery is a virtue, in the West, they simply say bravery is a virtue. The Hindus say, on the contrary, bravery is a virtue of the Kshatriyas. They do not consider bravery as a universal view or a universal quality. And the Hindus have an essentialist view of class or caste or jati. And this has, of course, been criticized in contemporary times. Now, I continue with the article. Is there any system to this particularism? So, India believes in particularism. He is asking, is there any system to this particularism? Indian philosophers do not seem to make synoptic systems like Hegel's or Kant's. Synoptic systems are not made by Indians. They are not making structures that are universal. Cheryl Daniel, we already mentioned her, speaks of a toolbox. Now, Cheryl Daniel's book is called The Toolbox Approach of the Tamil to the Issues of Moral Responsibility and Human Destiny. That is given in the bibliography. So, Cheryl Daniel talks about a toolbox of ideas that Indians carry about. They have lots of ideas which they use according to the situation, and from which they use one or another without much show of logic. They will just take one tool or another without showing much logic, and she says they will create a whole with whatever parts are available or tools are available. With whatever is available at hand, they will create a whole. They will create something. So he's saying anything goes into their bricolage. Remember, at this time when Ramanujan is writing, Derrida had just critiqued Lévi-Strauss's concept of bricolage. Bricolage is creating a whole with whatever is available. A slum dweller will create a house with whatever bricks, some tarpaulin, some cardboard, some plastic sheets, etc. He will put together and make whatever is available a house, isn't it? As against the engineer. So in India, everything is bricolage, and any idea, everything goes into their bricolage, says our Ramanujan. Max Weber, in various writings, distinguished traditional and rational religions. Max Weber is a famous sociologist, and he distinguished between traditional religions and rational religions. Hinduism, for example, is a traditional religion. Rational religion, says Max Weber, is what led to rational economy or capitalism. Rational religions like Christianity led to rational economy or capitalism. He studies why the Oriental and the Occidental developed in two different ways. The Oriental had traditional religions and the Occidental had rational religions. Now, what is rational religion, you will be thinking? Clifford Geertz, a very important philosopher, summarizes the distinction better than other writers. Let us hear what Clifford Geertz has to say about rational religions. Traditional religions attack problems opportunistically as they arise in each particular instance. Traditional religions like Hinduism is rooted in the particular. They attack problems opportunistically, employing one or another weapon chosen on grounds of symbolic appropriateness from their cluttered arsenal of myth and magic. The approach is discreet and irregular. In traditional religions, they don't follow a very logical, rational thinking process. Instead, they are rooted in magic. They are rooted in irregular, irrational thinking, myth and magic. And rationalized religions, on the other hand, are more abstract, more logically coherent. They apply thinking and logic and more generally phased. In traditional religions, what is the question? They will use, to use a classic example from the English anthropologist Evans Pritchard. He's quoting Clifford Geertz is quoting Evans Pritchard. And he's saying, in traditional religions, we will ask, why has the granary fallen on my brother? Instead, in rational religions, the same question will be asked like this. Why do the good die young and evil flourish as the green bay tree? So they will apply logic. They will draw generalizations and conclusions from particulars and focus on the general, the universal. Rational religions will focus on the universal, and it led to overarching rational economies like capitalism. So in this section, which is the third section, our Ramanujan has been talking about what is India. He talked about inconsistency and hypocrisy. He talked about the lack of distinction between India inside and outside, and he also talks about the focus on the particulars. And we also talked about Thinai poetics at this time. To illustrate his ideas, he has given numerous examples also. That brings us to the discussion of this third part. A third trait that Ramanujan points out, along with inconsistency and hypocrisy, is the lack of universality and focus on particulars. He proves this by comparing Manu, the Indian philosopher, with Immanuel Kant. Manu does not formulate universal generalizations like Kant. Kant focuses on the universal, Manu on the particular. Manu does not formulate universal generalizations like man must not kill, according to Ramanujan. On the other hand, Manu would say, for example, what punishment would befall a Kshatriya, a Vaishya, or a Shudra if they kill or defame a Brahman. From that, Ramanujan goes on to discuss what is the concept of universalization. Universalization is the backbone of New Testament, of all Judeo-Christian ethics. He is quoting Hobbes and others, but not of Manusmriti. In Manusmriti, universalization is not there at all. To be moral for Manu is to particularize, to ask who did what to whom and when. All the very particular case, the context of the crime is what will judge whether it is moral or not. Look at Vikram and Vetal. Justice presented in Vikram and Vetal is not based on generalizations or universalizations. It is always based on the particular. Vikram and Vetal. Yeah. Indians do not have synoptic systems like Hegel's or Kant's. Overarching systems are not there in India. Anything goes into their bricolage. In India, everything is makeshift and bricolage, always changing, fluid, more post-structuralists. So we have finished 3 out of 6 parts and we'll take a break. The remaining of the essay will be discussed in another video. I hope you enjoyed.